911 emergency.
I think I need to report a break-in and a murder. My wife is on the floor, bloody, stiff, not moving.
This is the voice of George Tiaffay. Stopping by his wife's house with their 8-year-old daughter, he found the garage door open, a suspicious sign which led him to investigate. And when he went into the house, he found his wife Shauna unmoving on the floor, already long dead.
When's the last time you saw her? All right, did you go good? Take a deep breath.
I'm a fireman. I was at work yesterday, so I saw her about 36 hours ago, I guess.
In 36 short hours, the lives of George Tiaffay and his daughter were changed forever. Shauna, from whom George was estranged but still married to, was dead, and this respectable firefighter was left to pick up the pieces. But there was a twist: burglary, surveillance footage, and a shocking accusation. Let's dive into the twisted story of Shauna Tiaffay's tragic murder. It was the early hours of September 29, 2012. Cocktail waitress Shauna Tiaffay is shown here on CCTV, clocking out of her job at the Palms Casino at 3:01 a.m. on that day. It would be the last time she ever did so, and the last time she was ever captured alive. She drove 30 minutes back to her house. She let herself in through the garage and moved through the house without turning the lights on, just wanting to go straight to bed after a long and tiring shift on her feet all night. She walked down the hallway towards the stairs, and this was when it all went horribly wrong. There was someone lying in wait for Shauna in the darkened hallway. They had a hammer. They lunged for her with it. She put her hands up in front of her face to protect herself, but her attacker broke her fingers and then beat her with the hammer until she was dead. This was how George Tiaffay found her. At 9 a.m. the next morning, the mother of his daughter had been horribly murdered in her own living room. But why and who killed her? Let's go back and learn more about Shauna. Her story begins in Salt Lake City, Utah. Born in March 1966, she was raised Mormon alongside her sister and 5 brothers. The family remained in Utah until she was 12, when they moved to Pennsylvania and later Virginia, where she attended South Lakes High School. There, she was popular and known as a girly girl, an outgoing personality on the cheerleading team. She graduated in 1984 and looked set to have a bright future on the East Coast. But born and raised out west, perhaps she missed the desert climate, because in 1994, at the age of 28, she moved back across the country to Las Vegas, Nevada. The bright lights of so-called Sin City couldn't have been further from Shauna's Mormon upbringing. She moved out there to be closer to her sister Paula, but Vegas isn't known as the home of family-friendly fun. While she initially worked in upscale retail stores like Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, she had her sights set on Vegas's vibrant resort and casino scene, which can be incredibly lucrative even as a waitress, and certainly entails meeting a lot of interesting people. A few years after moving, she got a job as a cocktail waitress at the Fiesta. From there, she was in the lucky position to get the same job at the Palms Hotel Casino when it opened in 2001. Shauna loved her job, finding it glamorous and exciting. Her co-workers felt like family. One co-worker said, "I never saw Shauna with a frown or anything. She was just so bubbly and laughing at everything," and that she just loved cocktailing. The work was exciting and also very rewarding. Shauna made close to $100,000 a year in salary and tips, which were often paid in casino chips. In Vegas, these function the same as money does. On a good night, she could make $500. In 2024, this comes out to be the equivalent of nearly $850. So Las Vegas wasn't just a party city for Shauna, it was a city of opportunity. She liked making money, and she liked spending it too, but more on that later. It was at her job at the Palms in 2002 that she met her husband, George Tiaffay. Born in September 1972, George was 6 years younger than Shauna. He grew up on a chicken ranch. His father died when he was young, and he was brought up to work hard on the farm. This ethos of hard work carried over into his education. He graduated as valedictorian of his high school class and went on to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers, building schools and water systems in third world countries, and when he left the military, he was dissatisfied by the mundanity of a civilian engineering job based in an office, so he became a Las Vegas firefighter. George was charismatic and had something all-American about him, according to those who knew him. He was a family man who sent money home to his mom, who was looking after his disabled sister. A hard worker, he was also considered handsome and was featured in a firefighter pinup calendar. It was no wonder that Shauna felt drawn to him when she first met him at the Palms in 2002, and no wonder that the two hit it off. 1 year after they first met, their daughter was born. Another 3 years later, they got married in Hawaii, a picturesque beach wedding, on March 16, 2006, 3 days after Shauna's 40th birthday. The photos display a happy couple enjoying their time together, picture perfect, with no hint of the tragedy to come. This was in 2006. In 2008, however, things would change, not only for George and Shauna, but for millions of Americans and indeed people across the world. It was the year of the Great Recession, the worst-scale economic downturn to hit the U.S. since the Great Depression in the 1920s. The recession doubled unemployment rates to more than 10%. It was triggered by the bursting of the housing bubble, and it affected housing across the country, but particularly in Vegas. As a city that relies on tourism, particularly the casino industry, which necessitates its customers having money to spend, and construction, it was hit hard. Foreclosures were common, and the unemployment rate in the city skyrocketed to 14%. The Tiaffays were not immune to this crisis. George himself lost money in the housing market crash, and like many families, they had to adjust their lifestyle to fit their new circumstances. This led to tensions in the home. He began to become jealous and controlling. He accused Shauna of dressing like a slut for work in front of their daughter, who was an impressionable little girl. She didn't want him saying things like that under any circumstances, but especially not where their daughter could hear him. He complained about her spending habits, which only aggravated the situation, since she was used to earning her own money in rapid, hard-working shifts cocktailing and spending it how she wanted. Shauna also took issue with a man George hired to do jobs around the house. This man was homeless, and George appeared to be doing him a good turn, but Shauna found him creepy and said his presence made her uncomfortable. The marriage only continued to degrade. They'd been together for a decade and married for 6 years when Shauna decided she'd had enough and finally moved out of their family home. It was April 2012. Their daughter was 8 and they began sharing custody, but it was difficult since Shauna continued to work long nights as a cocktail waitress and George's shifts as an EMT and firefighter were just as long and arduous. As a result, their daughter spent a lot of time with George's mother, who lived in the nearby area. Perhaps it was for her daughter's sake that Shauna wasn't ready to give up on the marriage, or perhaps it was that she was an idealist who'd achieved her dreams of working among the bright lights of Vegas and she couldn't surrender her handsome, charismatic husband or the beautiful family he'd provided her with. She carried an optimism with her, and she convinced George that they should see a marriage counselor. They spent the summer trying to work on their marriage, but in early September things started to go wrong in Shauna's life. Her townhouse was burglarized. Someone broke in and used her shower and stole her wedding ring and a pair of her bathing suit bottoms. The burglar also left something behind, a pair of boxer shorts, size small. The break-in was understandably terrifying, but Shauna, forever the optimist, made no security upgrades to her house, believing that lightning wouldn't strike twice. She was wrong. The early morning of September 29th was only 3 weeks later. She left work at 3 a.m., tired and stressed about her marriage, parenting her 8-year-old daughter, and the recent burglary. She didn't have the energy to be vigilant, and she couldn't have expected that someone would be there, waiting in the dark with a weapon, waiting for her. The wound in the side of her head was so deep that the paramedics, dispatched after George's desperate 911 call, initially thought she'd been shot. This had been a deliberate and uncompromising act designed to kill. The police were immediately suspicious of George. In cases of marital strife, the husband is usually the prime suspect, but George had an alibi, as he'd explained to the operator over the phone and also to the police, who interviewed him at the scene.
She was lying on the floor.
Okay.
And she was covered in blood. I just want to die.
What shift did you work yesterday?
A 24-hour shift.
George had been on call at the firehouse all night. Their daughter had spent the night at her grandmother's house, and George had collected her in the morning, stopping at Shauna's house because their daughter wanted to pick something up. They'd happened upon the gruesome scene by what appeared to be sheer coincidence, and George could not be the killer because he had an alibi. The case rapidly hit a dead end as a result. Other than George, there were no real suspects. Interviews with Shauna's co-workers revealed nothing other than she was a sweet, bubbly person, a good employee, and a hard worker who would be sorely missed. The police began to suspect that maybe there was a predator stalking the neighborhood. Women who worked at the casino in particular were frightened, fearing they'd been targeted. The burglary of Shauna's house became a suspicious warning sign. Had it been the killer? The investigators didn't know. But 2 days into their investigation, they caught a lucky break. A man named William Penix, known as Big Will, came to them with important information pertaining to the case. He had lived in Las Vegas for years and worked as a maintenance man for an apartment complex. He lived a life on the straight and narrow and tried to help others do the same, including a friend he knew only as Greyhound. Greyhound lived in a tent in the foothills, a very different sort of life from the glitz and glamour of Vegas in the movies. He was an ex-con, and Will had been helping him get his life together. But one day in September, Greyhound came to Will with a confession.
He said, "I got something to tell you." And I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "I just murdered a woman."
According to Will, Greyhound hadn't even seemed to feel guilty about it. He'd seemed satisfied with the fulfillment of a task, the promise of a reward. He said he'd hit the woman over and over with a hammer until the hammer broke. So Will called the cops. Initially, they were dubious. As a lead in the investigation, it seemed too easy to be true, but they followed it up anyway. Greyhound was known to steal food from an Albertsons grocery store, so the investigators went there with Will to find out where he'd last been seen. Will also knew that Greyhound sometimes sold drugs at the gas station next door, but they didn't need to talk to any witnesses to find him in the end. Will spotted him right there on the street. The cops approached him. He had drugs in his possession, which enabled the investigators to take him back to the police station. Greyhound's real name turned out to be Noel Stevens, and he fervently denied what he'd told Will about killing a woman with a hammer. Without a confession, the police needed physical evidence to tie Stevens to the crime. They launched a search for his campsite, scouring through miles of Vegas desert on foot and with a helicopter. Finally, out in the foothills 8 miles from the Vegas Strip, they found Noel's campsite, and they found the evidence they'd been looking for. It was a rolled-up pair of Stevens's pants, hidden half under a bush, and the pants were bloody. The investigators tested them for DNA right there and then. When the DNA result came back, the truth was clear. Noel had been involved in Shauna's killing. It was Shauna's blood. They could leverage this in Noel's interrogation. They told him that someone had come forward, telling them that he'd killed Shauna. They were stretching the truth, since of course Will didn't know who Shauna was, but the technique worked. Noel confessed. He had hidden in Shauna's house, lying in wait, and attacked her with the hammer when she came home from work in the early hours of September 29th. But there remained a problem. Why? Why would this homeless ex-con even know who Shauna was, much less have a motive for killing her? The police examined Noel's cell phone for clues. What they found there would shock them and turn the whole case upside down. They found George Tiaffay's number. They asked Noel who George was, and Noel said, "That's my friend, the firefighter." He said George sometimes paid him to do work around the house, and the pieces came together. Noel was the homeless man George had brought around to do domestic tasks, the one around whom Shauna had felt so uncomfortable. Her killer had been known to her. Worse, she'd sensed he was dangerous. So how was George tangled up in this? The day of the murder, Shauna's sister Paula had held her own suspicions. She and her husband called George when they found out about Shauna's death, and they recorded the call.
Hello?
George?
Yes,
This is Paula. Can you tell me what's going on?
Shauna passed away.
And what did they do to her?
I don't know, just laying on the floor with blood.
George was with a grief counselor when he took the call, standing just outside Shauna's house. After this brief conversation, he handed the phone over to the grief counselor, who talked with Paula and her husband. But Paula wasn't in the mood to be consoled. She needed to share her suspicions.
No one else can hear what I'm saying, correct?
Correct.
I have my suspicions that her husband may be involved in this, based on many conversations I've had with my sister. I highly suspect that he may be involved.
Now, initially this wasn't taken seriously, simply because George had such an ironclad alibi for the time of the murder. It was easier to blame a homeless ex-con like Noel Stevens than an upstanding citizen, a firefighter like George Tiaffay. But the two seemed to be connected. Investigators discovered on Noel's cell phone that he and George had called each other 87 times in the last month. This was far more than a friendly acquaintance. They'd first met when they were living on the same street. Before Noel moved out into the desert, he'd been living with his sister only a few doors down from George and Shauna. They got to know each other, and Noel began to do odd jobs for the Tiaffays, which continued when he'd left his sister's house and became homeless. Noel idolized George, who was charismatic and put out an air of success despite his recent financial troubles after the housing market crash. So when George gave him $600 with the promise of thousands more to come to kill Shauna, Noel didn't say no. Noel agreed to do it. Initially, Noel told police they discussed staging an accident. Noel would hit Shauna over the head and then put her in her car, driving it into the wall. But an autopsy would reveal the blow to the head, arousing suspicion. They also talked about suffocating her with a plastic bag, but Noel worried that he could get scratched, leaving her body with his DNA. According to Noel, George floated the idea of committing the murder at the Palms and drew up a map showing where Shauna parked her car. But when Noel climbed the wall into the parking lot, he was startled by the high security presence, customary at a casino setting, and took off. Finally, the pair settled on Shauna's house as the best location to commit this callously planned killing. George gave him a key. Noel used this key to scope out the scene about 20 times, including breaking in 3 weeks before the attack. This was the mysterious burglary when he stole her jewelry and underwear. Far from a one-off break-in, this was a precursor to something far more deadly, organized and arranged by her own husband. Investigators found surveillance footage of George and Noel at Lowe's together, buying a hammer, a knife, and gloves a few weeks before Shauna's death. Noel then led the police to the spot where he buried the hammer itself. Noel's attack had been so violent that the hammer handle had snapped in two. It had a barcode matching Lowe's. Put together, this added up to damning evidence of George's own involvement. 9 days after Shauna's murder, on October 8, 2012, the investigators confronted George's family with this evidence. They were horrified and disbelieving, and after the meeting, George's sister called him, presumably to tell him what the police suspected. George dropped his daughter off at his mother's house and took off in his truck immediately, speeding through city traffic onto the Summerlin Parkway. He floored it to 90 miles per hour and accelerated into a barrier, hitting it headlong. There were no skid marks, and it was believed to be a suicide attempt. He survived because he was wearing a seatbelt. Lying in his hospital bed, George Tiaffay was charged with his wife's murder. At the police station, Noel Stevens was also charged. He pleaded guilty in 2013 and agreed to testify in a deal that meant prosecutors would not seek the death penalty against him. But for the prosecution to prove that George had been the instigator, Noel would need to make a convincing witness. He had a stutter, brought on by stress, and Big Will confessed that sometimes he didn't believe what Noel said, but Noel spoke spoke on the stand anyway.
Are you just doing work for him, or is there something?
Friends.
What kind of things have you done together?
We worked out, stuff like that.
He admitted that he'd been the one to break into Shauna's house and leave behind the pair of boxers, and that this had been a dry run for the actual murder.
Who told you to make it look like a robbery?
George did. I hit her in the head.
What happens when you come out that door and you're holding that hammer?
She tells me why I'm doing this.
She says, "Why are you doing this?"
Yes.
Who told you to kill Shauna?
George.
This was the last nail in the coffin for George Tiaffay. Although Noel admitted to experiencing hallucinations and had a troubled past, it seemed clear that the plot was too contrived for him to have invented it. He also told the court that leaving the garage door open was a signal the pair had invented, so that George would know he'd done the job when he came by the house the next morning. This makes it even more chilling that George brought his 8-year-old daughter to Shauna's place that day. George did not take the stand, and the only witness in his defense was his sister, who testified to his good character and peaceful nature. This was not enough. On September 3, 2015, George was found guilty on all counts, including murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in December 2015, but in 2017 he attempted to appeal. He wrote the 100-page handwritten petition himself, since his lawyer had quit the case, most likely as a result of what his appeal alleged, which was that he'd had ineffective counsel. He also argued that he'd been affected by drugs he was taking for an injury received in the line of duty as a firefighter, and had been told by God that he needed to kill Shauna in order to protect his daughter. This appeal was denied. The court's response was this: that George plotted the murder while he worked, cared for his daughter, and fostered an amicable relationship with the victim to avoid any suspicion related to her death. Given the patience, subterfuge, and perseverance involved in this plot, the appellant has not demonstrated a reasonable probability that he would not have been convicted or would have received a more lenient sentence. As the reason he'd done it, the police and prosecutors believed it was all about money. Investigators had found evidence that George had been trying to hide money through his mom, and the tensions in their marriage had begun with the Great Recession and had continued to circle around Shauna's spending habits. This, it seemed, was the reason he'd contracted Noel Stevens so coldly and cruelly to murder his wife. Both Shauna and Noel remain in prison to this day. In 2023, George and Shauna's daughter graduated high school. She's been living with her grandmother ever since the tragic events of 2012. What do you think about this tragic story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, keep up with our channel, and we will see you very soon on The Decoder.